Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk for a Friday Mailbag special. Now, this is the show where we talk general aviation for pilots and student pilots to help keep you safe. I'm Max Trescott, and each week I hear from many of you, but often there's not enough time to include all of your emails in the weekly show. Now, several of these emails are in response to episode 328, in which we talked about the crash of a CFI who purchased a Piper twin Comanche and crashed it on the way home. So if you didn't hear that episode, you may want to check it out at aviationnewstalk.com/328. And today, several listeners share stories about problems they've encountered in flight. You just gotta love the stories, so stick around. Our first email comes from patron supporter Bill Ayer. He writes, your review of the 100-page FAA reauthorization bill in episode 329 highlighted many worthwhile initiatives. A post-audit of previous bills would show that only a small fraction of the initiatives are completed on time, and a significant percentage are never completed. Plus, there is little prioritization among the initiatives. The reauthorization bill process is fundamentally flawed. In drafting the bill, Congress doesn't consider existing FAA priorities, staffing, and budgets. There's obviously no slack today at FAA, and essentially no resource for new projects without further delaying current ones. And then, as the due dates come and go, Congress holds hearings to ask why things are delayed, requiring additional FAA time. I'm not defending FAA's cumbersome organizational structure or rulemaking processes, but those are not likely to improve in the near future. So we end up with a huge list you reviewed, driven by the industry lobbying Congress, with little to no input from the FAA and unrealistic due dates. The predictable result is a frustratingly low completion rate and initiatives being worked on that are of varying levels of importance. I'd advocate for a new process which would result in a much shorter list of high-priority initiatives, which would have broad industry and FAA buy-in and realistic delivery dates. Unfortunately, that's not where we are, and history is likely to repeat itself with this latest bill. And that's keen insight into the process from Bill, who formerly ran an airline. Here's a message from John Slusser.
Hey, Max. John Slusser. I fly out of Torrance, California, and I fly a Cirrus SR-20 G6. Want to just say thanks for the show and everything you do for the aviation community, making it a safer place and actually a lot more fun, if we can say fun, on a safety-oriented show like this. But I have a simple question that I get different answers for depending on who I talk to. And that is, when I shut down the engine and I need to turn my prop to get that tow bar on, which way should I turn it? And why? And I get multiple answers for this. I want to get your take on it. So thanks again for the show. I'm a loyal supporter and a friend, and just want to say thank you. Have a great day, Max. Bye.
John, thanks so much for your question. Now, I mentioned this many years ago, but it's definitely worth repeating. And I'm not surprised that you got multiple answers. Here's what you need to know. When rotating a prop by hand, your primary goal is to preclude any possibility of that prop accidentally starting. Now, that could happen if the mag key is not in the off position, or if one of the wires called P-leads that connect to the mag switch is broken. And in addition to this, there would need to be a small amount of fuel remaining in the engine. And that could happen if you quickly turn the mag switch to the off position before the propeller has come to a complete stop. So don't be in a rush to turn off the mag key. Always wait until the prop is completely stopped before turning off that key. Now, when you're sitting in the airplane, the prop turns in a clockwise direction. And when you move a prop by hand, you want to turn it in the direction that's opposite from the normal rotation. And if you're standing outside in front of the prop looking at the plane, you want to turn it clockwise from your current view, which would be turning the prop in the opposite direction from its normal movement. So just remember clockwise, which is the way you see the prop when you're sitting in the seat, and the way you'll turn it when you're standing in front of the prop and looking at the plane. Now, the reason we do that is that when you rotate a prop in the opposite direction from its normal direction of rotation, the magnetos cannot generate a spark that might cause your engine to start as you rotate the prop by hand. Now, some people may have told you that rotating the prop backwards may shorten the life of the shaft that connects the vacuum pump to the engine. Frankly, I'm a lot more concerned about shortening my own life than about shortening the life of a vacuum pump. So that's why you never turn a prop in its normal direction of travel. And by the way, since you fly a Cirrus, there's actually zero benefit in turning the prop in the normal direction of travel because Guess what? No Cirrus built in the past 21 years has a vacuum pump in it. Yes, some of the early ones did, but there are very few of those around. Thanks so much for your question, John. And by the way, if you'd ever like to do what John did and send a recording with a feedback or a question, I've got a new easy URL that you can use to record up to 90 seconds. And when you do that, it's emailed directly to me. Just go out to aviationnewstalk.com and click on Send a Recording at the top of the page, or go directly to aviationnewstalk.com/record. Now, we have a number of emails from people commenting on episode 328 and the crash with the CFI on board the twin Comanche that he just purchased. This first one comes from Patreon supporter Sam Dawson. He writes, Max, 328 was another great show. The only thing I have to add about this accident is about the aircraft insurance checkout the accident pilot supposedly received. Giving the new owner the benefit of the doubt, even if he logged 15 hours of dual received over 2 days, that's hardly a time frame that's conducive to learning about a new airplane. The purpose of an insurance checkout isn't just to check a box, but to help a new owner learn about the purchased airframe. Things such as fuel systems, landing gear and manual extension, avionics, handling, etc. Things that require not just flight time, but ground instruction as well. Again, good episode. Many things you mentioned are key to surviving. Sam. Sam, thanks so much for that. And here's an email from Steve in Illinois who writes, just listened to your podcast on November 8924 Yankee and wanted to give you my thoughts. When I purchased my twin Comanche 30 years ago, which I still have, I was advised to join the International Comanche Society. This is a type club for Comanche owners. I joined and attended their training and read their publications. I even kept a copy of an ICS article regarding troubleshooting the landing gear in my flight bag. Shortly after purchasing my twin Comanche and taking the training, I selected gear down while in the pattern to land. The gear did not come down. Based on the knowledge received from the ICS, I knew the first thing to check was the circuit breaker for the landing gear motor. I knew where it was from the training and reset it. The gear then functioned normally. This has not happened since. The training and knowledge gained from the ICS really helped me that day. I'm not a CFI, mechanic, or professional pilot. I'm just a novice pilot, so it might not be my place to give your listeners advice. But I would recommend that all Comanche owners, especially new owners, join the ICS and take the Comanche-specific training, obtain the ICS publications, and become active with the ICS. All systems are discussed in the training class, including the landing gear and fuel system. At the class, a Comanche is put on jacks, and all students are required to manually lower the gear. I still attend the class every few years as a refresher. As the current treasurer of the ICS, part of my duties is to sell the ICS publications to the members. I once spoke with a new Comanche owner who told me that he did not know that the green gear light dimmed at night. This new owner took his plane out for his first night flight and did not see the green gear light after he put the gear down. He thought the gear was not down, so he manually lowered the gear. I explained to this new owner that if you turn off the panel lights for a moment, the green light will come on very bright. After his experience, this new owner called me to purchase some of the ICS publications to further educate himself. Sorry for the length of this message, but I'm really troubled by this accident since so many Comanche owners have volunteered so much of their time and effort over the past 50 years to form the Type Club, develop the airplane type-specific training and publications in order to prevent these accidents. Steve, thank you so much for your email, and let me underscore just a couple of points that you make. One is that in many retractable Pipers, including the Piper Arrow that I have a lot of time in, there's a small wheel on the dashboard that turns the nav lights on and off, and it varies the brightness of the cockpit lighting. And in some positions, the landing gear lights just don't appear lit, so you might think the landing gear is still up, even when it's down. So new owners of Pipers or renter pilots of Pipers have to become familiar with that wheel and adjust it so that they can see the landing gear lights. Now, the other thing that you mentioned is type clubs. These are wonderful. There are around 100 of these clubs for different aircraft types. Over the years, I've belonged to 3 of them, and each of them has been worth far more than I spent to join them. And we talked for an entire episode about type clubs with Dr. Catherine Cavagnaro. That's episode 213, and you can hear it at aviationnewstalk.com/213. And here's another email about that accident. It comes from Mega supporter Carl Rossi. He writes, Dear Max, I just finished listening to your latest podcast while running in Mission Trails Park. Congratulations. Had a fine job as usual. I do have a few comments on this particular accident. One, although I have some sympathy for this pilot, after all, there was a rather famous Eastern Airlines crash into the Everglades when a professional flight crew that was flying an L-1011, as I recall, fixated on a burned-out landing gear indicator light. I'm a bit surprised that the pilot did not have a clear idea as to how to perform emergency gear extension. If this was really his dream airplane, then I would have expected him to do what many of us do, which is to spend lots and lots of time learning everything we can about our dream aircraft, reviewing the POH, watching videos, etc., before getting anywhere close to purchase. This is an interesting omission and one that I really cannot explain. 2, you mentioned a number of alternatives available to the pilot, such as not leaving the previous airport or simply landing gear up at his intended destination. There was a third option, which I think he should have exercised, and I'm surprised that he did not, namely declaring an emergency and landing at Charlotte International. Here he would have had all the necessary resources literally at his fingertips. Lots of help from ATC, well-lit runways, and excellent fire and rescue services. Seriously, the last place that I would want to be landing in an emergency is in a non-towered airport after dark when a wonderful alternative is located just 15 miles away. The hour or so he spent unsuccessfully troubleshooting his problems could have been much better used to fly to Charlotte and at the very least fly by the tower to confirm the landing gear position and also to land at that well-equipped airport. 3, as you mentioned, doing troubleshooting at low altitude, single pilot in the dark was difficult and dangerous and ultimately led to his demise. And also, of course, he didn't have a very good autopilot, so that's why he was having to hand fly. Number 4, I actually had a similar situation, and as many of my aviation stories seem to, this also involved our mutual friend, Rob Lober. Now, we've had Rob on the show. He runs Air Tahoe, which is a Part 135 charter company. He writes, "This occurred in June 1996. Rob and I were each flying our own airplanes to Eugene on a Friday to participate in a biathlon race the next day. Rob was leaving from Truckee while I was coming from Riverside. I was flying a Trinidad TB-21, which I'd owned for about 2 years, and which actually was for sale since I had just purchased my first Malibu. The flight from Riverside to Eugene was uneventful until it came time to extend the landing gear. This is when I heard a bang as the circuit breaker popped. I reset the circuit breaker and attempted to extend the landing gear again, only to have the circuit breaker pop again. At that point, I realized that there was a problem with the gear motor and that I would have to go and do an emergency extension. So I told ATC what was happening and flew just northwest of the airport to do some troubleshooting. Rob was already on the ground listening to all of this. I took out the POH and reviewed the emergency extension system. In the Trinidad, this required extending takeoff flaps, slowing to less than 90 knots, and then pulling the emergency gear extension lever, which released the hydraulic pressure in the gear system and should allow the gear to fall into position, assisted by a number of springs. So I went through the procedure and pulled the handle. First, the nose gear locked into position, then the left main gear. I now had 2 green lights. However, the right main gear did not show that it was locked. I did a low pass over the runway, and both Rob and the tower controller confirmed that the right gear was about 15 degrees from being locked down. This is where the fun really began. I asked Rob to call another gentleman I knew that was an expert on the TB-21. He suggested that I try doing various maneuvers to airload the right gear and see if I could get it to snap into a locked position. So I attempted to perform these, which were primarily a series of slips and abrupt pull-ups. This was all taking place at relatively low altitude at the end of a 4-hour flight and with my fuel beginning to run low. I belatedly came to the realization that I was far more likely to hurt myself in these useless attempts to fix the problem as opposed to simply landing the airplane with one of the gear not locked down. And that's exactly what eventually happened. Luckily, I shut the engine down on short final and landed somewhat hard on the left main gear. While the airplane continued to roll down the runway, I held the attempt to keep the right wing up as long as possible. Imagine my surprise after rolling to a stop to find the airplane sitting perfectly upright and to look down at the gear indicators and now see 3 green lights. According to Rob, when I bounced on the left gear, the right gear snapped into position. The main lesson that I learned from this whole situation was to not make a controllable situation worse by attempting to save the day. The airplane was perfectly capable of landing without the right main gear locked down, but in my mind I was concerned about the fact that the airplane, which was currently for sale, would be damaged, and that would at the very least delay and probably have an impact on the sale price. Unfortunately, the pilot in this crash did like so many others and spent far too much time trying to solve a problem which really didn't need to be solved. As you pointed out, the worst that could have occurred is to land gear up. By the way, when I talked with the folks at Trescott a few days later and described my problem, they reassured me that it was impossible for the emergency extension to fail. Good to know. Carl, thanks so much for your email. Here's an email from Stefan Ballmer. He writes, I just finished listening to episode 328, the crash of November 8924 Yankee because of a burnt-out gear light bulb. It hit home because I had very similar gear problems on at least 4 occasions. Every time it turned out to be either a light bulb or a limit switch. Even knowing that it's likely a trivial issue, my standard procedure in this case is the same. Ignore the gear and fly the airplane. 1, go around. Thanks for the earworm. He's talking about the song we play at the end of every episode. 2, tell ATC so they can give me a heading and altitude at a safe place and keep an eye on me while my eyes are inside the cockpit. And 3, engage the autopilot and ensure it's safely engaged. 4, only then I will start jiggling light bulbs and cycling the gear. But the main reason for writing is that I wanted to share 2 additional things I learned dealing with these incidents. 1, autopilot use. If you fly a retractable, I recommend you go practice using that autopilot with the gear extended, particularly in a climb. I had to learn that the hard way, taking off into a 500-foot overcast at night when the gear refused to come up. Following my standard procedure, I engaged the autopilot as soon as practical. But with the extended gear, my climb performance was reduced, and the airplane was flying the relatively low VY speed. Slow speed, of course, means that less bank is required for a standard rate turn. The analog autopilot, however, had fixed gain for banking the airplane and ended up over-controlling the airplane, oscillating around the target heading for a few times before settling down. I had never seen that oscillation before because the gear normally comes up before the autopilot comes on. It was extremely distracting in IMC at night, knowing that I had some issue with the plane because the gear wouldn't budge. Since the gear motor never came on, I actually wondered whether I had an electrical issue that was also affecting the autopilot. As usual, in the end, it turned out to be another limit switch, this time one that prevented the gear retraction to activate. And 2, parking the airplane and driving. Whenever I've decided to park the airplane, I didn't actually have to rent a car. That's because in all flying clubs and pilot groups I've belonged to over the years, it's an unwritten rule that we go pick up stranded fellow pilots at no charge. It makes the decision to park the airplane a lot easier. And over the years, I've even got some good excuses to go flying because of that rule. Cheers and thank you for the show. I'm sure it has saved lives. Blue skies, Stefan. Stefan, that's great. Thanks for mentioning that unwritten rule. And yes, one time when I got stranded in my seaplane, another lake amphibian owner came out and got me, which was good because I had no way of getting out from where I was on the water. And here's a question from John Sandage. He wrote, I'm going to be 61 years old in August. I have always wanted to get my pilot's license. Could you advise what hurdles, if any, that I might encounter with my age? Also wondering what medications going forward that would be an issue. I appreciate your time and any insights you can think of. And here's what I wrote back to him. I said, thanks for your email. Great that you're about to start flight training. One hurdle is that it will probably take you more total hours to get a certificate than it would for someone in their 20s. So whereas a younger person might take 60 to 70 hours to get a private if all goes well, it might take you 15 to 20 hours more. On the other hand, you may have better study habits than a young person, in which case it might not take much longer. The biggest potential hurdle is getting a medical certificate. If you're taking a variety of medications, you want to do some research ahead of time before going to see an AME, a doctor who can give you an FAA medical exam. For example, some medications are banned altogether, while others may require a letter from your personal physician that you'll need to take with you when you see the AME. You can either research it by searching the AME guide, which you can find here, and I'll include that link that I sent to him. It's an FAA link to the AME guide. I wrote, or if you're an AOPA member, you can call their 800 number and talk to a medical specialist who can give you some guidance regarding any medications you may be on. To solo most airplanes, you need a medical. So before you spend a lot of money on flight training, you should first research whether you can get a medical. If you can't get one, you should consider flying gliders or sport category aircraft, which are lighter weight 2-seat aircraft, since neither of these require an FAA medical. Also, you can look into Basic Med, which is an alternative to a medical. John, thanks so much for your email. Hope your flight training is going well. And now let's congratulate Mega supporter Eric Himes. Here's what he sent to us.
Hey, Max. Eric Himes. I've got some great news. I was finally able to attain my instrument rating. So it's in the books on the commercial. So after 2 years of juggling work, family, life, about 50 hours of instrument simulated time, 35 training flights, most of those with my son, who was also my CFII for a period of time, 6 total instructors, 83 instrument approaches, and 39 holds. And a nice, we'll call it, 5-hour ground and practical exam just a couple of days ago. So here we are. Very grateful for all those who helped me along the way. And also just want to give a shout out to you for the G1000 and Perspective Glass Cockpit Handbook, which definitely helped me. Also a shout out to Dragonfly Aviation out of Winder, Georgia, and specifically Parker Torres, Mason Scoggins, Marlon Brooks, and there's a few others that definitely deserve some credit putting up with my training needs, we'll call it. So thanks again for all you do for general aviation.
Eric, congratulations and thanks for sharing your story. Hopefully that's going to motivate some other people who are somewhere in the process of getting a new certificate or rating. And now one of our newest mega supporters, Jarrett Davis, sent me this email last week. It's kind of funny. He says, Max, I've listened to every show, and every time I hear you say about people's credit cards expiring and changing, and I'm like, yeah, not me. Sounds like FAA macho attitude, doesn't it? Well, it was me. I apologize for lapsing for the last year or so. I just rectified that and upgraded the tier to increase my donation to try and account for my sins, my version of the ASRS NASA report. I hope that all is well and love the show. Now flying a turboprop, but love all the topics and helping me to keep up with the fundamentals of flying that I still get some rust on then. See you at Oshkosh, I hope. Jarrett, thanks so much for increasing your support level to become a mega supporter. And of course, mega supporters are the largest contributors to support the show. They donate $50 a month and they get access to my online courses. And after 2 months, I send them a signed copy of one of my books. But you don't have to be a mega supporter to support Aviation News Talk. There are lots of ways to support the show at a variety of different dollar levels. And you can make monthly contributions through either PayPal or Patreon, or a one-time donation through Venmo, PayPal, or Zelle. So if you've been listening to the show for a while and you look forward to each new episode and you feel like you're getting some value from the show, well, stop what you're doing right now and just take the 2 to 3 minutes it takes to sign up to support the show. It's easy to do. Just go out to the web to aviationnewstalk.com/support. And when you do, I'll read your name on the show. And if you sign up via Patreon, you get all kinds of goodies, including a special version of each episode where I don't ask you to sign up because you already have. Thanks so very much. Now here's an email from Terry Hand. He wrote, I have your Max Trescott's G3000 book and I find it very helpful. The G3000 is a very capable system. It's different from my 25 years of 757 and 767 FMS usage and 4 years on the A350 before being pasteurized by the age 65 rule. Don't get me started. Now, for better or worse, it's just different. I'm trying to learn as much as I can about this new-to-me system, and your book is a big help. But I've been trying to find an answer to what is probably a stupid question. Of course, Terry knows there are no stupid questions. What is the yellow boxed enunciator HDG heading that appears to the right of the current heading that's displayed just above the HSI? A new SIC asked me, and I had no answer and couldn't find one. Help. Simplify, Terry Hand. Well, Terry, thanks for your email, and I hope you're having fun flying the G3000. I absolutely love that system, and it's in probably 7 or 8 different aircraft. I see it all the time when I fly the Vision Jet. Now, there are many different enunciations for these systems, and a lot of them are different in different airplanes, so I couldn't put all of them in the book. But I did pull up one reference guide. You didn't say which plane you're flying, so I just pulled up the Cessna M2 cockpit reference guide, and it says that yellow HDG heading enunciator you're getting indicates that there's a difference in heading sensors that's more than 6 degrees. So undoubtedly there are two magnetometers in your aircraft, and one of them is giving a different reading. Now that might happen sometimes if you're parked close to a building and there may be one sensor in each wing. Whichever wing is next to the metal building may get distorted a little bit, and that could cause you to get that. Some of the other comparator enunciators are ALT, which means there's a difference in altitude of greater than 200 feet. Another indication is IAS, and it's got a lot of different things, but one of the issues is it could be the sensors are off by more than 10 knots. PIT, difference in pitch sensors greater than 5 degrees, and ROL, difference in roll sensors is greater than 6 degrees. Terry, I hope that helps, and have great fun flying that G3000. And we'll be back in a moment with more of your emails. But first, let me ask you, are you flying an airplane equipped with the Garmin G1000 Perspective or the G3000 or G5000? If so, do you know everything there is to know about the system and its autopilot? I'm sure you've read the POH for your airplane from cover to cover, but have you done that for your avionics? Even if you know a lot about the G1000 or G3000 and the autopilot, there's probably more to learn. And you certainly don't want to be struggling to figure out the nuances of the system as you're flying in the clouds. People who've read my books tell me they are much easier to read than the Garmin manuals. Plus, they have a great index, so it's easy to look up any feature you're trying to figure out. To truly master a plane, you have to also master the avionics. So call to get my Max Trescott's G1000 and Perspective Glass Cockpit Handbook or my Max Trescott's G3000 and G5000 Glass Cockpit Handbook. The former is $34.95 and the latter is $44.95. Commit to doing that now and call 800-247-6553 to order. And here's an email from Artum Liss. He writes, "Hey Max, lovely podcast. Thanks as ever. The bit where you spoke about making a game out of adhering to all the FARs was especially interesting. Like you, I'm all for following rules, but here's one I've been struggling with, so I thought I'd run it past you. Would be really interested to hear your opinion. We fly a Grob 109B motor glider. Everywhere in the world, its maximum weight is 908 kilograms. Everywhere, that is, except in EASA land, and as a consequence, in Britain. At some point, the British Civil Aviation Authority decided that the max weight for a motor glider cannot exceed 850 kilograms. Funnily enough, the same aeroplane, when used by Army cadets, is flown to 908 kilograms. The decision to limit the weight was, as far as I can tell, purely arbitrary. They needed a weight limit for the category, so they set it. Now, our airplane weighs 660 kilograms empty. Doesn't take much to recognize that it's simply not possible to fly it two up with more than a spoonful of fuel. So, like all other owners of this particular make and model in the UK, we treat the maximum weight as 908. I wonder what you'd make of this from your perspective of treating all aviation rules as golden and unbreakable. Do you have any mindset advice for our predicament? Artum, wow, that is really unfortunate. It does put you in a difficult position. The best thing, I think, would be to petition the CAA in Britain to change it, but who knows whether that would work. The big concern I would have is that insurance might not cover you if it were discovered that you were flying above 850 kilograms, as the insurance might be void when an aircraft is purposely flown beyond its limitations. I'm sorry, I just don't have a better answer for you, but thanks so much for your email. And here's an email from patron supporter Dr. Catherine Cavagnaro, who we've had on the show many times. She says, "I'm listening to a recent episode and enjoying it, but if the drunk helicopter pilot had a blood alcohol content of 0.35, that's almost 9 times the legal limit of 0.04. Am I understanding it correctly?" And Catherine, in that particular case, I was reading the news story in which they said, something like 4 times the limit. They were obviously referencing the limit for driving a car, which was 0.08 in that state. Catherine's correct. The limit is much lower for flying an airplane, and it's 0.04. Also, you can't drink any alcohol within the 8 hours preceding a flight. And here's a question from mega supporter Dan Morris. He writes, "Good evening, sir. I just finished up listening to this latest episode. Thanks as always. Since you're the resident instrument professional, I have a question. I'm here at KDTN, the Shreveport Downtown Airport in Louisiana, and our 14/32 runway is closed until Halloween. The other runway, 5/23, has an out-of-service PAPI and an LNAV-only approach. On the remarks for the approach, it states, straight-in minimums NA at night. Does that mean we can only use the circling minima at night? Does it mean we have to circle or just that we maintain that higher altitude? Off the approach end of runway 5, there are trees that you absolutely cannot see. So it makes me wonder. Additionally, our FOM at the school states that we must have VGSI, or visual glide slope, during night flights. I asked the question about the PAPIs being out of service and was told by the chief pilot that we can just load the approach and use the glide path on the RNAV 5. I'm not exactly sure how I feel about that. Thoughts? Well, Dan, I wouldn't say I have a definitive answer on this, but I can say that the FAA often takes the most conservative interpretation of rules, and for my own personal safety, I use conservative interpretations as well. If you want to know a definitive answer, you might email your local FSDO and ask them. But here are my thoughts. You're correct. The notes do say straight-in minimums NA at night. Now that tells me that you cannot descend to the straight-in minimums of 728 MSL and instead must fly to the higher circling minimums of 800 feet. If that doesn't get you below the clouds, you won't be able to land. Now the next question is, can you land straight in? Many mountain airports have only circling minimums because the MDA is so high that it would be difficult to land straight in without either slipping or doing a 360 or something to bleed off altitude that you could land straight in. Yet, you are permitted to land straight in on these circling approaches, though it might not be a stable approach. In your case, the most conservative interpretation would be that you can't land straight in. However, since you can land straight in from circling minimums, I'm inclined to believe that you're allowed to land on runway 5, but you'll need to stay at the higher circling minimums until you're in a position to land. Apparently, this approach has an advisory glide slope, as your chief pilot mentioned using that. For sure, I would not fly below 800 feet on the advisory glide slope unless I had the airport in sight. I'd also suggest flying the advisory glide slope first in the daytime just to verify that it provides plenty of obstacle clearance. And here's an email from David Hassano who writes, I'm glad to donate to your show as it, without a doubt, helps me to become a safer pilot. I've been listening for about 2 years, which coincides with my decision to get back into aviation. I'm a commercial pilot with a Gold Seal, CFII, and MEI, but I haven't given instruction in several decades. I flew SIC and corporate jets in my early 20s and worked full-time in the Part 91 and 135 world for several years. I decided to change careers and flew here and there as a contract pilot until around 2013. For not quite 10 years, I didn't fly at all, but then got the urge to buy a plane and began private aviation for business and family benefits. After an extensive search and a false start, I ended up with a very nice V-35 Bonanza. With that purchase, I decided to use a BPPP instructor to help ease me back into aviation. We did about 10 hours of training, which included a transit across the central U.S. to bring the airplane home. After a few days of training, I was competent enough to get back in the air VFR. After getting my wings back and gaining some confidence in the Bonanza, I did an IPC with a career instructor that I've worked with before. I set my personal minimums at 700 to 1,000 feet AGL, depending upon other factors including visibility, winds, runway length, type of approach, etc. I've since stuck with those guidelines closely and have not pushed myself into uncomfortable situations. Today I was returning to my home airport after a weekend away at a family vacation home. It was just an hour-long flight, and I had about 3 hours and 45 minutes of fuel on board. Just prior to the time of departure, the reported conditions at the destination were 2,200 feet broken, with a visibility of 10 miles and light rain. The forecast was for a ceiling of 2,500 foot broken and great visibility, so I wasn't required to file an alternate. In flight, when I checked in with the TRACON that handles traffic to my destination, the onboard ADS-B weather was showing a ceiling of 2,200 foot broken, so just a little lower than forecast. The controller asked about my approach preference, and I requested the RNAV-10 circling to runway 28. I understand the increased risk when circling approaches are involved, and I will not fly them unless the reported ceiling is above the normal pattern altitude and visibility will permit a typical pattern. Everything was as expected, and I broke out at about 1,000 feet AGL and set up for a left downwind. As it requires a phone call on the ground to cancel a flight plan at this airport, I elected to cancel before entering the pattern, as I expected a normal traffic pattern and landing. There were 2 IFR planes behind me for the same airport. Subconsciously, I think that my fear of forgetting to cancel by phone and my desire to not hold up other arriving traffic prevented me from waiting until I landed to cancel my flight plan. As the destination is my home airport, I've canceled with ATC many times in the past before entering the pattern without any issue. Well, it was right about the time that I was abeam the numbers while on downwind when I flew into solid IMC. So there I was without a clearance and completely in the clouds. I reached out to approach and let them know that I had unexpectedly re-entered instrument conditions. At the same time, I started climbing but didn't have an altitude to climb to since I hadn't yet heard back from approach. I called approach again, advised of the unexpected missed approach, and was assigned an altitude of 3,000 feet and was instructed to fly the published missed approach. This required me to look down at the approach plate as I hadn't briefed the missed approach. About the time that I started turning to the holding fix, the controller asked my intentions. I told him that I wanted to divert to a nearby airport that had lower published minimums, multiple approach options, and longer runways. This was a good decision. I knew that I was task saturated and didn't want to attempt the same approach again to my original destination with its higher minimums, relatively short and wet runway, and congested surroundings. As the destination and the alternate are just minutes away from each other, the controller wanted to immediately vector me onto an RNAV approach at my new destination, but I wasn't ready. At this time, I requested delay vectors, which allowed me to get things settled down, reprogram my GPS, and double-check the configuration of the airplane. This extra 5 minutes was very helpful to me, as a too-soon approach would not have allowed me the needed time to reset myself in the airplane. I was thankful that I was fat on fuel and that there wasn't any rush to get on the ground. The approach wasn't perfect as I started to go through the final approach course before realizing that my autopilot was on heading mode and not in nav mode. That was corrected and a normal approach and landing were made. This autopilot mode mistake is not one that I suspect that I would have made had I not been a bit wound up from being caught in unexpected circumstances, starting with the unplanned missed approach. So there were a lot of takeaways from this day of flying. Some decisions were good and some were not. Not being prepared for a miss was a major mistake. I relied on an AWOS and didn't take into account the possibility that the ceiling would be lower than advertised. I hadn't briefed or prepared for the missed approach based upon my confidence in the weather report. I canceled my flight plan earlier than I should have based upon what I could see as soon as I entered VMC without considering the chance for change by the time I got to the airport. I did some things right as well. When ground contact was lost, I initiated a climb immediately. Deciding to go to an alternate took some of the pressure off, as I knew that my new destination offered more approach options and a wider, longer runway. The best decision that I made was to ask for delay vectors. That gave me much needed time to catch my breath, configure the plane, and reprogram the GPS. Had I accepted immediate vectors at the alternate airport, then I would have been behind the ball and rushing to catch up, probably without success. As you've discussed on your show in the past, single pilot IMC is very demanding. Doing it without having a solid autopilot is a bad idea in my opinion. Once a flight goes in an unexpected direction, any resource that helps to reduce stress and workload is of great value. I made my last good decision by opting to call it a day and get a ride home. It was inconvenient, but smarter than jumping back into the soup when I had already reached my limit for the day. I'll go get the airplane tomorrow when I'm rested and ready. I hope this story is helpful in some way to other pilots. It was completely my fault that I put myself in a high-pressure situation. It's a learning lesson for me. Thanks again, and I look forward to your show every week. David, thanks so much for sharing that story. And yeah, you know what I like the best about this is, you take responsibility, and that's what we do as pilots. Not all of our decisions are going to be great, but we have to continue to make the best possible decisions that we can. And thinking through these kinds of things ahead of time really helps us when we find ourselves suddenly in this kind of situation. Now here's a message from Troy Wisman.
Hi, Max. It's Troy from just south of Dallas here. I enjoyed episode 316, especially your discussion about route planning to connect the H's on upper-level weather charts so that you could stay north or south depending on the direction of flight and maximize the opportunities to have a tailwind. So many of us depend on tools like ForeFlight these days to do routing for best winds, so I thought your segment was a great reminder of how to get back to basics in a practical way. My feedback here is related to your memory aid on which way the winds flow around high and low pressure centers. I too struggled with remembering which one had clockwise winds and which one had counterclockwise winds. So when I was learning all this, I developed my own memory aid that served me well. So here's how I do that. I remember that we hang clocks high on the wall and counters are installed down low. That's it. Keep up the great work. Thank you.
Troy, thanks so much for that tip on how to remember that winds travel clockwise around high-pressure areas and counterclockwise around low-pressure areas. And you can support the show when you buy a Lightspeed headset. Now, I've been using only Lightspeed headsets for over 25 years. I currently have 4 of their different models, which I use in different airplanes and helicopters. 2 of my favorite things about Lightspeed are their trade-up program and their support. The trade-up program lets you trade in an older Lightspeed headset for a new model, and they'll give you hundreds of dollars of credit for your old headset. I've used that program at least 3 or 4 times over the years to trade up to newer models, and I love it because it preserves my investment that I made in the original headset. And their support is great. They've never charged me a penny for fixing any of my headsets, and their turnaround time is relatively short, which is important to me, as I often fly 5 days a week. When you buy a new headset from Lightspeed, they will send a donation to the show, but only if you use one of the links in our show notes first to get to their website. To find those links, just go out on the web and type in aviationnewstalk.com/Lightspeed. By the way, my favorite model is the Lightspeed Delta Zulu because I have some hearing loss, and the Delta Zulu has a built-in frequency equalizer that you can custom tune to your ears to compensate for any hearing loss. It took me only just a few minutes to set that up, and I find that it makes it a little easier for me to understand ATC transmissions. Again, check out all of their models by going to aviationnewstalk.com/Lightspeed. Thanks so much. And just a reminder that I love hearing from you, and I read many of your emails on the show. If you'd like to send me a message, just go out to aviationnewstalk.com and click on Contact at the top of the page. That's absolutely the best way to send me a message. But probably the best way you can support the show is by telling all of your friends about Aviation News Talk. And if they're not familiar with how to listen to a podcast, and probably half the population doesn't know how to do it, show them how they can subscribe to the show for free on their smartphone. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up, and remember that you can always go around.
You can always go around if it don't look right coming down. Don't wait until your side's maybe sliding upside down. You can always